On top of being a leadership consultant, I'm also a gamer. Or at least I would be if I didn't have so many kids. I still play some video games, but not as many as I used to. And back when I used to, I was a big fan of the company Ubisoft. You've probably heard about them. They've seemingly gotten themselves into a lot of hot water recently. And I saw an opportunity to bridge the gap between leadership and gaming by pointing out 4 big failures that Ubisoft has been making and the lessons that we as leaders can take away from them. For those of you that aren't in the gaming know, Ubisoft is a publicly traded company based in France with offices worldwide that makes a lot of popular video game series like Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, and the Tom Clancy games, among many others. They were at their heyday in the mid-2010s, but since about 2017, they've been in decline. And we're going to take a look at 4 big reasons why that's probably the case. So let's get into it. Mistake number 1, not listening to feedback or criticism. As Ubisoft began its decline in the mid-2010s, it started pursuing what I guess you could only describe as somewhat greedy money-making strategies, moving away from its focus on the benefit to the consumer and just about making money as fast as possible. Gamers definitely expressed a lot of their dissatisfaction in non-constructive ways, probably even toxic ways. But that doesn't mean what they had to say was invaluable. There were plenty of valid criticisms about Ubisoft's work. Ubisoft's games became notoriously buggy, repetitive, and formulaic, and I've already mentioned the somewhat predatory money-making strategies like having monetization in single-player games that you already had to pay money to play. That's just to name a few things. What was the response of Ubisoft management? Well, according to a report that was recently put out by YouTuber Legendary Drops, they basically told all of their staff to ignore all the criticism, to write everything off as toxic gamer rage. If these reports are accurate, that means that Ubisoft is actively not listening to the criticism of their fans. And when your entire business is centered around providing enjoyable experiences to your fans, that's not really a winning strategy.
Not a great plan.
The lesson we need to learn from this mistake is pretty obvious. Lesson number 1, be open to criticism and feedback. I think most of you will recognize that Ubisoft's blanket ban on listening to criticism was the wrong approach. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of negative views about feedback and criticism in the first place, and so some people are probably understanding why they would have some hostility to it. Let's examine the value we can derive from listening to feedback and criticism. Criticism and feedback can help us find growth opportunities by pointing out areas where we need improvement. What about toxic criticism? Should we listen to that? I think it's clear that Ubisoft's labeling of all criticism as toxic criticism closed them off to a lot of potential growth opportunities and ways to improve their products for their customers. I mean, no doubt they were receiving a lot of toxic, non-constructive criticism, some of which wasn't even valuable at all. But by labeling everything toxic criticism, they were throwing the critical baby out with the critical bathwater. I hate to say this, but during your career, you're going to receive feedback and criticism that isn't constructive. Everybody does. Some of it will probably even be toxic. I wish more leaders and managers didn't give out criticism this way, but not everybody listens to what I have to say about leadership. Should you ignore non-constructive criticism or toxic criticism? Yes and no. The organization Alcoholics Anonymous has an expression that I like. That's take what you like and leave the rest. It's about sifting through any particular thing. In the case of AA, it's about sifting through their program and pulling out the parts that you like or the parts that you're willing to act on in that moment. Well, the same thing can apply to criticism. In all its forms, toxic and otherwise, criticism presents us with opportunities to build resilience. It makes us more adaptable. It teaches us to manage our own emotions, and in the cases of the more negative criticism, teaches us how to manage the emotions of others. Receiving criticism, even constructive criticism, doesn't feel very good. It challenges your self-image and raises self-doubt. But one of the things about being a leader is accepting criticism, regardless of how you receive it or how it sounds. When we receive criticism, we need to listen to it, and I mean actively listen to it. Make sure that you completely understand what the other person is saying before you respond to the criticism. The same goes for non-constructive and toxic criticism. You may have to work a bit harder to sift through and tease out the critical issue, but you should still do that before you respond. And whatever you do, don't take the Ubisoft approach of sticking your fingers in your ears and singing la 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 I can't hear you. Once you've heard the criticism and it's your turn to respond, start by asking questions to broaden your understanding of the critical issue. My recommendation is to ask open-ended questions. These are questions that can't be answered with yes or no or one-word answers. Try asking questions like, "It sounds like you think X was the wrong decision. What approach do you think we should have taken?" Or, "I'm hearing that you didn't like X. How do you think we could improve on it in the future?" Ubisoft would be in a much better position right now if they had been open to having these discussions with their consumers. Imagine if Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot had sat down with a popular gaming YouTuber and asked, "Hey, we've noticed that you guys aren't enjoying our products as much as we used to. How do you think that we could improve on the experience for our consumers?" Now, this highlights another essential strategy for giving and receiving criticism, and that's having face-to-face communications, or in the world of Zoom and Meet and whatnot, having screen-to-screen communications. Either way, it adds an extra layer that just can't be communicated through text messages or email. Body language and tone of voice are crucial for getting your point across and really understanding the issue at hand. The most important aspect of receiving criticism is the learning experience that it provides us. And that's not just learning to improve on whatever critical issue is being discussed. It's also just the very experience and practice of receiving criticism itself. It seems clear that Ubisoft's management wasn't very adept at taking criticism, which is why they responded so reactively to it. Had they been more practiced at receiving criticism, it would have been easier for them to sift through the toxic stuff and pull out the critical issues and the areas for improvement that they could have acted on. And yet they didn't take this opportunity. This failure to listen to, respond, and understand the criticism they were receiving has no doubt contributed to the decline that the company is now facing. And final criticism that Ubisoft has not been handling very well is the treatment of its employees, which, well, leads us to our next big leadership mistake. Mistake number 2. Not taking care of your people. In addition to the negative consumer sentiment, Ubisoft also seems to be struggling with relationships between employees and management. In 2020, Ubisoft employees started blowing the whistle on an incredibly toxic workplace environment at Ubisoft, including severe allegations of workplace misconduct and sexual harassment, often involving upper management. Ubisoft employees made it sound like management first tried to ignore the problem, but then when it wouldn't go away, they were very slow to respond with any meaningful changes. Yves Guillemot also recently told Ubisoft employees they needed to take more responsibility for Ubisoft's worsening financial position. Of course, Ubisoft employees unsurprisingly felt like they were being thrown under the bus. Moreover, as their financial position worsens, Ubisoft's management has resorted to cost-cutting measures like job cuts and restructuring, further driving a wedge between employees and management, now that the employees fear that their jobs are on the line. Again, the lesson here seems pretty obvious. Lesson number 2, take care of your effing people. It goes without saying that fostering a culture where workplace misconduct and sexual harassment are rampant is completely unbecoming of a leader. If you discover these problems at your company, you have to deal with them immediately. You've probably heard the expression, "an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure." Well, that works for workplace misconduct too. It's part of leadership's role to establish a workplace culture and to define clear company expectations. A workplace code of conduct, backed by consistent enforcement, would be the best place to start. That code of conduct should then be followed by clear policies and procedures that are communicated and understood at every level of the company. Appropriate training, support, and feedback mechanisms provided by leadership are necessary for ensuring the proper impact of the company's new culture. This can include a process for handling misconduct allegations, anonymous reporting, thorough and transparent investigations, fair and unbiased evaluations of the allegations, and appropriate and proportionate sanctions. The employee reports are to be believed, then it sounds like none of this is happening at Ubisoft. On top of these other allegations, it also appears the company is struggling with work-life balance, with numerous Ubisoft employees complaining about the use of crunch in order to meet release windows for video games. Now, the video game industry is notorious for crunch, or the practice of using things like mandatory overtime and other techniques to get your employees to work well beyond normal amounts in order to meet release windows. Although there are other industries that use it as well. But we shouldn't believe that crunch is sort of a necessary evil of video game production. There are plenty of companies, like Supergiant Games, Insomniac Games, and even gaming giant Nintendo, where work-life balance is much better respected. In the case of Supergiant Games, apparently instead of mandatory overtime, they have mandatory days off. To demonstrate that crunch really isn't necessary, Supergiant Games' most recent release is a game called Hades, which was both critically well received and very popular among consumers. And industry analysts estimate that the game netted close to or around $200 million for the company, while having a development budget that was about 1/10 of that, which, in all honest opinion, is a very decent return on your investment. Now, in the case of crunch-heavy Ubisoft, their most recent release was a Star Wars game called Star Wars Outlaws. Now, it's hard to tell exactly how much it cost Ubisoft to make, but industry analysts suggest that these massive games made by these huge gaming corporations are now costing in the hundreds of millions of dollars to make. And Yves Guillemot recently came out saying that Star Wars Outlaws' budget for marketing was one of the largest budgets Ubisoft has ever had, which suggests a very heavy investment on the part of Ubisoft. Now, it looks like they've only sold maybe about 1 million units of the game so far, which is far from being anywhere close to making their money back.
I am never going to financially recover from this.
Now, I won't make the wild claim that Ubisoft's treatment of its employees is what led the game to fail. I mean, there's plenty of game companies that treat their employees like crap and they still make profitable games. But it does demonstrate that you don't need to treat your employees like crap in order to make a profit. Study leadership even for a moment, and you'll realize that treating your employees badly is just wrong. Having a positive relationship between leadership and employees requires building trust and respect and having a lot of empathy. These are all things that seem quite deficient at Ubisoft. I can't predict Ubisoft's future, but I can't see that future being very positive without a complete overhaul of their company's culture. They're going to need to improve work-life balance by prioritizing their employees, but also focusing on improving their planning process by establishing reasonable deadlines for the products that they produce. Ubisoft management is also going to have to improve their communications with their employees, focusing on clear communication of expectations and results. They'll also want to add in some sort of feedback mechanism so that they can hear from their employees and identify problems before they spiral out of control and require an enormous amount of crunch in order to resolve. Finally, in this new culture, Ubisoft's management is going to have to take full responsibility for the actions of the company. That includes the highs, but also the mistakes and the failures. And they're going to have to effectively and clearly communicate this new responsibility to their employees, their shareholders, and their customers. Now, I lost my crystal ball some time ago, so I can't honestly predict what Ubisoft's management is actually going to end up doing, but at least you can learn from the mistakes that they're making and act on it in your own leadership practice. Now, this all brings us to our next big mistake from Ubisoft, a lack of communication. Mistake number 3. Communication that isn't honest or transparent. Earlier in 2024, Yves Guillemot was quoted calling a upcoming release, Skull and Bones, as the first quadruple-A game. Obviously, he was riffing on the AAA moniker associated with games produced by large gaming corporations. The problem here is that this comment was made during an earnings call in response to an investor questioning the high release price of Skull and Bones. Having your CEO engage in a little bit of hyperbole isn't usually a mortal sin, but in the case of Skull and Bones, on release most consumers were disappointed with the game, and very quickly the quadruple-A moniker was adopted by people mocking Ubisoft and the game itself. This mockery has now extended to other Ubisoft releases like Star Wars Outlaws. Quadruple-A game has become synonymous with a mediocre game made by Ubisoft. Likewise, their treatment of the controversy surrounding their upcoming game Assassin's Creed Shadows also lacks transparency and cultural sensitivity. Ubisoft is being accused of hiring activist consultants to argue on their behalf. I won't weigh in on that controversy because enough people already have, but it's clear that Ubisoft's lack of transparency and honesty in their communications isn't doing them any favors. The internal communication problems that I touched on previously only further add to the long list of communications mistakes that the company's making. Lesson number 3. Good communication is one of the pillars of leadership. There's no other way to put it. To be a good leader, you have to be a good communicator. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be an exceptional communicator, but to be a good leader, you have to have the basics of communication down. Every piece of communication has a purpose. It has a message to deliver. And the focus of each piece of communication should be to have the target audience understand the message being delivered. A lot of video game companies struggle with the clear and concise messaging that makes for good communications. And while Ubisoft is among them, it's not exclusive to them. I've always always like the expression under-promise and overachieve. Video game companies tend to do the exact opposite of that. Ubisoft does this quite regularly, building up hype for games that don't end up getting released, or for games that are released years and years after they're originally announced and end up being shadows of the original promise, like Skull and Bones, for example. Copywriters will tell you that the best communications meet the audience where they're at, entering the conversation they're already having in their own heads. In a strict communication sense, that means having a really good understanding of your audience and crafting communications that meet their needs and expectations. It also means having respect for your audience and treating your audience as though they matter. In the case of Ubisoft, writing off a large portion of your audience as though they're toxic and they don't matter, or telling your employees that they're the reason you're having financial hardship, are sort of the opposite of that. Good communicators are also adaptable, adjusting their message based on feedback from their audience, or to align with new priorities or new information. To do this properly, good communicators must be transparent and honest with their audience. But authenticity requires engaging in a somewhat challenging behavior. To be an authentic communicator, you need to be in touch with and in control of your emotions. Authentic communicators speak from their hearts. As human beings, we're social animals. Tens of thousands of years of human evolution have given us an innate sense of telling when people are being phony. We're really good at detecting when people are hiding or obfuscating their emotions. Those people tend not to feel genuine to us, even if only on a subconscious level. Speaking from the heart means sharing your true feelings and emotions in your communications. If you have reservations about a given strategy, share those feelings. If you're dissatisfied with the way your product is performing or how your customers are receiving your product, share those feelings with your customers. Be honest and even apologize. Our emotions drive our decision making. Now, we may rationalize it after the fact, but it doesn't change how we arrived at the decision in the first place. Using authentic communication and bearing our emotions is an excellent way to build rapport and trust with the people that we're communicating with. A different approach altogether is being currently employed at Ubisoft. It's what you would call a reactive or ego-based communication style. Authentic communication requires supplanting the reactive and protective nature of our egos. Authenticity requires a level of vulnerability that our egos aren't usually comfortable with. Referring to your game using a never-before-heard moniker like quadruple A is a very reactive and ego-based style of communication. Its lack of authenticity, which was immediately obvious to most people, is likely what drove all of the mockery. However, responding to that shareholder's criticism authentically would have required a level of vulnerability that Ubisoft's management doesn't seem capable of. Hopefully you'll be able to learn from Ubisoft's communication failures here, because honestly I'm not confident that they will. Mistake number 4, not having a cohesive vision. The primary purpose of leadership is to craft a vision and inspire your people to follow it. I would even go so far as to say that if you don't have a cohesive vision that you're inspiring others to pursue, you're not practicing leadership. Now, the more I examine Ubisoft's management style, the more I truly believe that Ubisoft as a company does not have a cohesive vision. Ubisoft is a company that makes video games, but their reason for doing so, their vision, is opaque at best. Obviously, Ubisoft is trying to make money, but that's what all companies are designed to do, and it's a byproduct of pursuing their visions. As leadership guru Simon Sinek says, the vision is the why. It's the reason you do things. And when we look at Ubisoft, it's hard to understand the why of their making video games. I think that this lack of vision is what's led Ubisoft to chase after what you can only describe as fads. Their desire to milk the open world formula until it turned to dust, for example, or their quadrupling down, pun very much intended, on live service games, or even bizarre oddities like NFTs. I would even go so far as to say that Ubisoft's current surge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is probably more management chasing a fad than sharing the values that DEI supports. But what really happened? How did Ubisoft go from a gaming powerhouse to become this fad-chasing, greed-hungry, consumer-ignoring mediocrity factory? I have a theory, and interestingly enough, it involves Napoleon III. In 2015, around the time of Ubisoft's initial decline, another French company called Vivendi tried a hostile takeover of Ubisoft. Vivendi, a large, multifaceted company founded by Napoleon III as a water supply company of all things, turned its focus to media in the 1990s. By the 2010s, they were in the midst of establishing a gaming division. They'd already acquired mobile game developer Gameloft, and they'd set their sights on Ubisoft as their next acquisition. By 2017, Vivendi had acquired a 27% stake in Ubisoft. Now, under French law, had they reached 30%, they would have been required to submit a formal takeover offer. The Guillemot brothers responded in what I would imagine to be an obvious fashion, fighting tooth and nail to keep Vivendi from acquiring their company. And by 2018, they'd succeeded, getting Vivendi to eventually sell off its entire stake in Ubisoft. At the time, Ubisoft's management celebrated this as a huge victory for the company, but they've never really been the same since. Understandably so. Losing your entire company to a hostile takeover is going to give you some issues. I think it's at this point that Ubisoft went from being a innovative and proactive video game company to a defensive and reactive one. They really started playing conservatively, playing it safe, and just trying to make as much money as they could. And I really think that this is the beginning of Ubisoft's downfall. This is what led them to start making all the mistakes that we're discussing in this video, and many more, to be honest. They survived the crisis, but it changed them. The company was shaken to its core, and honestly, their vision just never recovered. Lesson number 4. You cannot have leadership without vision. The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet, notwithstanding, go out to meet it. Thucydides. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind, and if a blind man guides a blind man, both will fall into a pit. Matthew 15:14. When I say that Ubisoft's current malaise is due to a lack of vision, I hope I'm truly underscoring just how dire the situation is for this company. Without a cohesive vision, it's really a team of managers that are leading Ubisoft right now. There is no true leadership. They're stuck in a holding pattern, which is actually a really good way of describing post-Vivendi Ubisoft. But without leadership, they'll never break out of that pattern. And in order to have leadership, again, they need to have a why. They need a vision that will inform every decision they make at the company. In your own leadership practice, you need to craft a vision, whether it's for your company or your department or your team. That vision will be your North Star. It will guide you. It will inform your decisions. Without this cohesive vision, you're doomed to fall into the same pit that Ubisoft finds itself in right now. How does Ubisoft get out of this situation? Well, Yves Guillemot and Ubisoft's board of directors needs to knuckle down and set a cohesive vision for the company. And they need to let that cohesive vision start making and informing all of their decisions going forward. What vision would I recommend for Ubisoft? Ubisoft is the best. Ubisoft makes the best games. Ubisoft games have the best gameplay, the best story, the best characters. Ubisoft treats its consumers the best, with transparent and authentic communication. Ubisoft treats its employees the best, setting the industry standard for work-life balance and employee satisfaction. When faced with exploitative live service models and fads like NFTs, Ubisoft would have a guiding star that would help inform the decisions. They could ask themselves, do these fads that we're chasing make us the best? And if the answer is no, they can abandon them. The same would apply to their taking criticism. If the criticism, regardless of whether it's toxic or not, would help make them the best, they can listen to it. If it doesn't help them be the best, they can safely ignore it. Now, I'll freely admit, it's really easy to play armchair CEO and rattle off a few ideas of how Ubisoft could become a better company. And I'll acknowledge that what I'm actually suggesting is for Ubisoft as a company to completely realign its focus and its values. And that's no easy feat. But unfortunately, I see no other way of them healing from their takeover trauma and becoming the bright, vibrant company that I remember when I used to play their games all the time. I would love to see Ubisoft return to its past heights, but it needs a cohesive vision in order to get there. And honestly, I'm just not confident that the management at Ubisoft has what it takes to go through that journey. Hopefully, unlike Ubisoft, you can take away the most important lesson from this video, and that's without a vision, you cannot practice leadership. Now, that's not to say you can't adjust or amend your vision from time to time, but you cannot abandon it. If you abandon your vision, you abandon the practice of leadership. As a leader, you need to hold on to your vision. Inspire others around you to do the same. Be relentless in your pursuit of the vision. Respect it, and it will guide you to success. If you would like help applying the lessons from this video to your own leadership practice, or if you'd like help with any other aspect of your leadership practice, I'm available for a free 1-hour chat. Just go ahead to the link in the description and book some time with me now. Thank you for watching. All you leaders out there, take care.